the purpose of this series of videos is to create a list of games associated with a particular subject. A lot of times, since I do a lot of war games, it'll be a particular battle, war, general, that kind of thing. I thought I'd start by looking at the Peloponnesian War. There's a manageable number of games associated with it, and I've always liked ancient battles. Now, due to the vagaries of the American educational system, I thought I'd probably try to clear up some confusion about the 3 P words. That's the Persian Wars, the Peloponnesian Wars, and the Punic Wars. Now, the Persian Wars were Persia versus the combined Greek kingdoms. And think Marathon and Thermopylae, like the movie 300. Greece wanted to expand its colonies into Asia Minor, which is now Turkey, and the Persian Empire, which is now most of the Middle East, wanted to expand westward. This lasted for about 50 years. The Greeks won. The Peloponnesian Wars were a civil war between Athens and Sparta, and they occurred a decade after the end of the Persian Wars. They were fought in the Greek peninsula with 2 of the major battles, Plataea and Leuctra. Sparta eventually prevailed, and the war ended the golden age of Greece and Athens, and it allowed Philip of Macedon and his son Alexander to roll down from the north and take over a couple of decades later. Finally, the Punic Wars were 2 separate wars, and they took place about 150-200 years later, and involved ancient Rome instead of ancient Greece. And Rome's nemesis was the Carthaginian Empire in North Africa. The Second Punic War is probably the most famous. Think of the invasion of Rome with Hannibal crossing the Alps with the elephants. Major battles included Trebia, Cannae, and the ultimate Carthaginian defeat at Zama. Now, the games that I suggest in this list usually have to be readily available through some sort of retail source, either new or used, or available on Vassal. Now, I've also left off some of the generic ancient battle games like Ancients, PRESTAGS, and Command and Colors Ancients. And I arrange the list very roughly by the game's complexity. I start with the simpler games, and I move on towards more intricate and complicated ones. So let's get started. So the first game I'll talk about is Sphacteria. It's part of Vivictus's Peloponnesian War Quad. It's basically 4 games having to do with specific campaigns or battles of the Peloponnesian War. It comes with an 8.5 by 11-inch map, 67 counters. It has 8 pages of rules, and it's really pretty easy to learn how to play. It recreates the Battle of Sphacteria in 425 BC, where a force of Spartans were stranded on the island of Sphacteria and were set upon by an Athenian force. One player is in charge of the Athenians and the Messenian allies, and the other one leads the Spartans and their helots. Each player has 4 commanders to lead his units. To achieve victory, a player has to control the fortress of Pylos and the island of Sphacteria using his fleet and his land units while taking care of his supply. You use activation points for movement in combat, and players can play event counters to affect the outcome of actions. The second one in the Vivictus series that I'm talking about is Amphipolis, and along with Sphacteria, Hellespont, and Syracuse, it's part of the 4-part quad that was released in 2014. Comes with a 16-page rulebook, a 12-inch by 16-inch map, and a counter sheet of 108 die-cut counters. Now, Amphipolis is a historical game that covers the battles and operations carried out by the Peloponnesian expeditionary forces that were led by the Spartan general Brasidas in 424 to 422 BC. Brasidas was against the Athenians under Thucydides, Nicias, and Cleon. And it generally encompasses an operational scale. 1 turn covers about 3 months. In this game, there are 3 short scenarios. There's the Brasidas versus Thucydides, the expedition of Nicias, and Brasidas versus Cleon. There's also a longer campaign game. The third game of the Vivictus series is Hellespont, and it was released in 2018. It has 13 pages of rules, 108 counters, and another 12 by 16-inch map. And it focuses on the victorious campaign of Alcibiades against the Spartan Mindarus in 411 through 410 BC. It covers land, amphibious, and naval warfare, and it encompasses 3 battles: Cynossema, Abydos, and Cyzicus. And these 3 battles were where the Athenian fleet took back control of the straits, and Alcibiades proclaimed himself the savior of Athens. Syracuse is the final game of the Vivictus quad, and it was released in 2012. It has 16 pages of rules, 108 counters, and a 12 by 16-inch map. It covers the land and naval battles as well as the siege of Syracuse itself during the Peloponnesian War in 415 through 413 BC. And it recreates the invasion of Sicily by the Athenians. Now, this debacle ended up being the turning point of the Peloponnesian War, with the destruction of much of the Athenian fleet and army. The game has two scenarios, a historical one and a speculative one, where the great Athenian general Alcibiades avoided dismissal and headed the invasion. Now, a unique component of the game is the ability of players to build walls and fortresses during the siege. Next on our list is a block game, Athens and Sparta, and it was published by Columbia Games in 2017. It has 8 pages of rules, a 22 by 25 inch map, and 100 blocks that are used for units. Now, Athens and Sparta is a strategic level game that covers the entirety of the Peloponnesian War, with one player controlling the wealthy, seafaring Athenians and the other the disciplined army of the Spartans. The object of the game is to capture and control Greek city-states. Now, like other Columbia games, Athens and Sparta is a block war game with units represented by wooden blocks that are stood up with their backs facing the opponent. Now, this creates a fog of war aspect to the game. Now, when units lose their combat strength, these blocks are turned to represent the loss of combat factor. Power is asymmetric in this game, with Athens having naval superiority and Sparta having a more powerful land army. Revolts also complicate plans for both players, and like all of these block games, there's a card mechanic that's used for unit activation. Now, for those people who like Columbia block games, such as Hammers of the Scots, this would be a good choice. Now, I'd also mention the caveat that, like most other Columbia games, the rules can be a bit short, and they can also be a bit confusing. Hellenes, Campaigns of the Peloponnesian War, is a block game that's very similar mechanically to Athens and Sparta, and this game was published by GMT in 2009. Like Athens and Sparta, it uses blocks and a card-based activation system. It has 15 pages of rules, a 22 by 34 inch map, and 146 block units. The game is broken into 4 campaigns. There's a 431 campaign, a Sicily campaign, a 415 campaign, and a 413 campaign. And where Athens and Sparta has turns representing 4 years, Hellenes' turns represent 1 year. Hellenes also uses an I go, you go system instead of Columbia's move combat system. One thing unique about it is that it contains wintering rules. Now, while this game and the previous one both covered the same ground, they play out a little differently, and Hellenes is a slightly more complex game where momentum has to be balanced with attrition. Hoplite is the next game on the list, and it's part of GMT's Great Battles of History series that was made by Mark Herman and Richard Berg. It came out in 2014, and it specifically allows players to recreate the classic battles from the Persian and Peloponnesian Wars at a more tactical level. In some ways, it's like Ancients, PRESTAGS, and Command and Colors, and I was going back and forth, but I decided that it was specific enough to the subject that it should be included on the list. It comes with a 22 by 34 inch map. It has 4 counter sheets, which gives you 1,120 half-inch counters, 32-page rule book, a 48-page scenario book, and lots of player aid cards. Now, like other games in the Great Battle of History series, the rules are of moderate complexity, and it uses a chit-based random activation system. It also has rules for things like advances after combat, routes, phalanx movements, harassment with missile units, and personal combat. Some of the scenarios include Delium, Ephesus, Leuctra, Marathon, Platée, Nemea, and Tanagra. Polis, the fight for hegemony, is a little bit different game. It was published in 2012 by the Spanish gaming company Asylum Games. It has more in common with a resource management and civilization game than a traditional war game. Like many Euros, it tends to be moderately complex and lean towards the abstract. It has a 20-page rulebook, a game board, 64 cards, 32 tiles, and 85 assorted wooden tiles, pawns, and discs. Players in this game collect scarce resources, often through trade, and at the same time they attempt to bolster their populations and garner prestige. Now, while the components for this game look exceptional, I haven't really had a chance to play them. Not being a big Euro-style game fan, I probably will have this low on my priority list. Epic of the Peloponnesian Wars is a little more controversial choice. It was published in 2006 by Clash of Arms Games, and it has 8 different scenarios that can last anywhere from 2 to 20 plus hours and require anywhere from 2 to 4 players. It has a 36-page rulebook. It has 2 maps, which are 22 by 34 inches each, 560 counters, and 120 event cards. Now, while the mechanics of this game are simple, economics and politics play a factor in the gameplay. And while cards are important in the game, they don't control play as much as, say, a card-driven war game would. Now, the game remains a little controversial, with people either loving it or hating it. The intricacies of play and the simulationist nature appeal to a lot of people. However, the spotty rules and the sometimes static gameplay turn a number of folks off. The next one is the Peloponnesian War. This is an oldie but a goodie, and it was originally published by Victory Games in 1991, and it was designed by Mark Herman. It's now being published by GMT. It has a 22-inch by 34-inch map, 200 half-inch counters, a 24-page rulebook, and a historical commentary booklet. It's unique in that it was designed for solitaire play, and there are 3 scenarios and a campaign game, none of which lasts more than 3 hours. Throughout the game, the player's forced to switch back and forth between the Athenian and the Spartan side, and a strategy matrix is used to control the gameplay. Now, like most Mark Herman games, play is well thought out and the design is just flawless. Some people feel that the game is, however, more of a narrative engine than a war game, which is a problem that crops up with most solitaire games. The final game on this list, Pericles, the Peloponnesian War, is the Big Daddy game. This is the one that's the most complex. It's another Mark Herman design, and it was published in 2017 by GMT. It has a mounted map, 88 cards, 180 plus wooden pieces that includes cubes, discs, and sticks, a counter sheet with 130 counters, and a 24-page rulebook. Unlike the Peloponnesian War, which was a solo game, it's best with more players, and 4 being optimal. So with 4 players, 2 play the Athenians and 2 play the Spartans. Then each player represents a faction that wants to be the superior player of their side. That is, they want to be the best Athenian or the best Spartan. Now, the game is more of a sandbox game with an emphasis on politics and deal-making than it is a straight-up war game. Its playbook is very rich. It contains 44 pages of different scenarios that can last from minutes to hours, and a series of learning scenarios mitigates some of the difficulty of learning this complex game. However, remember, this is a big one. So there's an overview of Peloponnesian War games. If there's any that I've missed, let me know in the comments down below. And if you've played these and have any opinions, I'd like to hear those too. Anyway, see you next time.